Imagine this. You're a police detective, working a quiet shift in a small American town where most emergencies are typical noise complaints or the occasional stolen bicycle. But then, a call comes in, routine welfare check. Nothing unusual on the surface. Yet what you're about to walk into will haunt you forever. Inside a seemingly normal house, tucked away at the end of a quiet suburban street, you find something no one could have prepared for. Locked doors, boarded windows, and silence so thick it presses on your chest. As your flashlight sweeps across the dark hallway, you suddenly catch the glint of eyes staring back at you from under a bed. Children. Scared, filthy, and silent. That's the moment everything changes. This story isn't just about a rescue, it's about the horrifying truth that was hiding behind those walls. And trust me, by the end of this video, you'll have the answer you came here looking for. You won't believe what really happened in that house. Hey, yeah, I'm talking directly to you right now. If you've clicked on this video, you probably saw the title and felt that chill crawl up your spine. Children rescued from a nightmare house. And now you're wondering, how bad was it really? Who let it get that far? Who saved them? And how did no one see the signs? I know that feeling, when your curiosity and your gut are both screaming for answers. That's exactly what we're going to uncover together in this video. But I need you to stick with me, because this isn't just another crime story. This one is twisted. It's layered. It's going to mess with your head. But by the time we reach the end, you're going to understand what happened inside that house and why it matters more than you think. So take a deep breath and stay with me, because every detail counts. Let's be real. Stories like these hit hard. Not just because they're horrifying, but because they challenge what we believe about the world we live in. We want to think we'd know if something this evil was happening next door. That someone would say something, do something. But what if no one did? What if the people responsible were the very ones who were supposed to protect? What if the cries for help were buried under the sound of normal life? Lawnmowers, school buses, evening TV. This is the kind of case that forces you to question everything, especially the systems and people we trust. As we walk through this story together, I want you to think about that. Because it's not just about the horror, it's about how close that horror was to staying hidden forever. Now, let me set the scene for you. The house was nothing special, your typical two-story home, a little worn down but nothing that would scream danger. From the outside, it looked like a place where kids might ride bikes in the driveway or draw chalk rainbows on the sidewalk. But inside, it was a different world. A world of fear, silence, and twisted control. The neighbors didn't hear screaming. They didn't see bruises. And yet, what the detectives uncovered inside would shake even the most hardened officers to their core. We're talking about malnourished children who hadn't seen sunlight in weeks. Makeshift locks on the doors. Hidden cameras pointed at the kids' bedrooms. And diaries, yes, actual diaries, filled with stories so disturbing, officers had to step out of the house to catch their breath. You're probably wondering, how did it come to this? What tipped off the police? Who had the courage to ask the hard questions when no one else would? Well, that's where the heart of this story lies. Because while evil may have lived in that house, determination lived outside it. The detectives who got the call didn't treat it like just another day. They trusted their instincts. They asked the right questions. And they didn't stop until they broke through the walls, literal and emotional, that were keeping those kids trapped. These weren't just officers. These were people who felt something wasn't right and refused to look away. You're going to meet them. You're going to walk with them through the rooms of that nightmare. And you're going to see exactly how they pieced together the puzzle that so many had missed. But let's pause here for a moment, because before we dive deeper, I want you to really picture what it must have felt like to be one of those children. Imagine being told every day that the outside world is dangerous, that no one will believe you, that silence is survival. Imagine living in a world where punishment is unpredictable, where even the smallest noise can bring pain. Now imagine being pulled out of that world, suddenly and violently, by strangers you're supposed to trust. That's the emotional core of this story. Not just the horror of the abuse, but the long road to healing that follows. These children weren't just rescued, they were reborn. And what happened after the rescue is just as important as what happened before. There's another layer here too, one that most people don't think about when they hear stories like this. The manipulation. The lies. The way abusers twist reality until even their victims can't tell what's true anymore. That's the kind of psychological warfare that was happening inside this house. The adults in charge were masters of control, skilled at hiding their crimes and maintaining the illusion of normalcy. But no illusion lasts forever. Eventually, one tiny crack in the facade started a chain reaction that couldn't be stopped. And that's exactly what I'm going to show you. Piece by piece, we'll unravel how it all fell apart, how one determined detective noticed something small that everyone else missed, and how that detail led to a truth no one was ready to face. You might be feeling a lot right now. Anger, sadness, disbelief. That's okay. That's exactly what you're supposed to feel. Because this story isn't clean. It isn't easy. But it's important. Not just for justice, but for awareness. There are still children out there, right now, living in homes that feel like prisons. And the only way we stop it is by refusing to look away. So, if you've made it this far, thank you. You're part of the solution just by choosing to care. But we're just getting started. Because what happens next in this story? That's where everything changes. The truth starts to surface. The lies begin to crumble. And the people responsible finally feel the pressure closing in. So stay right here. Because in the next part, you'll hear the moment one child finally spoke the words no one ever expected. The words that would change everything. And once you hear them, you'll never forget them. 2 of 2. Just days before the rescue, the house on Elmridge Lane appeared, at least from a distance, like any other in the neighborhood. The lawn was overgrown, but not enough to raise alarms. The curtains remained drawn at all hours, though neighbors chalked it up to privacy. It wasn't until someone noticed the mailbox overflowing and a strange chemical odor wafting through the hedges that concern began to take root. And even then, those who lived closest admitted they never imagined what was actually going on behind that front door. To them, the adult who owned the home, a woman in her early 40s named Shannon Price, was just quiet. Odd. Maybe, but not dangerous. She kept to herself, declined invitations to block parties, and rarely made eye contact. Some chalked it up to anxiety or grief. After all, her husband had vanished under suspicious circumstances 3 years prior. No body, no goodbye, no answers. Just gone. That was the story she told. But the truth was far more twisted. And she claimed to be raising her sister's kids while the sister got help for her addiction. Shannon had once worked as a nurse, licensed, trained, and praised at one point for her ability to stay calm under pressure. But after a string of personal tragedies, including the death of her mother and a mysterious fire that destroyed part of her childhood home, something in her seemed to snap. Former colleagues described her as increasingly withdrawn, muttering to herself, even combative with patients. She was eventually placed on leave and never returned. But instead of getting help, she seemed to double down on her isolation, retreating deeper into a world of control, rules, and delusions. The only people who ever entered her house after that were the children. 3 of them. 2 girls and a boy. None of them were officially registered in any school system. No pediatric visits. No records. And yet, she introduced them as her niece and nephews anytime someone asked. It's important to remember how convincing some people can be when they're living a lie. Shannon knew exactly how to manipulate the narrative. She played the role of the concerned aunt, the responsible guardian doing her best under tough circumstances. She even had a story prepared for every little suspicion, explaining away bruises as clumsiness, thin frames as picky eating, silence as shyness. People believed her, because believing her was easier than confronting the possibility of something much darker. The police welfare check that led to the children's rescue wasn't even prompted by abuse allegations. It was a noise complaint. A neighbor reported hearing loud banging at night, like furniture being thrown or someone falling downstairs. That single complaint turned out to be the unraveling thread in a much larger web. Now, here's where the mystery begins to expand. Because Shannon wasn't the only adult seen entering the house over the past several months. There was a man, mid-50s, gray beard, thick glasses. No one knew his name, and he never stayed long. He would park his van around the corner, always at night, always with the hood pulled over his head. Some neighbors assumed he was a boyfriend, others speculated he was a therapist or social worker. But records show no such appointments, no official services. And when detectives pulled surveillance footage from a local gas station near the house, they found something even stranger. This man wasn't just visiting Shannon. He was seen handing her cash, sometimes envelopes, and once, a thick black duffel bag. So who was he? Was he helping her? Enabling her? Or something worse? As investigators dug deeper, they found that Shannon had a pattern of using different last names, multiple aliases on social media, several burner phones, and online orders for child behavior modification equipment, which included things like padded restraints and locks for doors that couldn't be opened from the inside. This wasn't negligence. This was premeditated. But still, the question lingered. What was she preparing for? And was she acting alone? Further complicating things was the reemergence of Shannon's estranged brother, Kyle Price. Kyle had a record, DUIs, petty theft, and a brief stint in jail for assaulting a former landlord. He hadn't spoken to Shannon in years. At least, that's what he claimed. But phone records told a different story. Late-night calls, encrypted texts, and a withdrawn savings account totaling over $30,000 that coincided with Kyle's sudden return to the area just 2 weeks before the rescue. Was he trying to help? Extort her? Or was he part of something even more sinister? Detectives couldn't ignore the timing. They couldn't ignore the fact that Kyle had recently taken a job at a local salvage yard, a place that just happened to be missing a very specific type of tool, hydraulic bolt cutters, the same kind used to install makeshift locks found on the children's bedroom doors. At this point, the investigators were facing a maze of half-truths and dead ends. Every clue they uncovered seemed to lead to another question. Why were there journal entries from the children that referenced the tests? Who was the man with the van? And why had Shannon wiped every hard drive in the house just days before the welfare check? And perhaps most disturbing, why were there photos of the kids in other homes, other locations, places they swore they'd never been? Was this bigger than one abusive woman? Was there a network? Trafficking? Cult activity? Or were they chasing shadows, pulled into a web of misdirection crafted by a deeply disturbed mind? The psychological tension around this case grew with every layer peeled back. One of the detectives described it as walking through a haunted house in the dark. You never knew which door would lead to the truth and which would lead to something you couldn't unsee. And while Shannon remained silent during her initial questioning, her body language screamed guilt. Twitching fingers, a constant tapping foot, and an eerie calmness whenever the children's names were mentioned. She refused to acknowledge their suffering, refused to even call them by their real names, instead referring to them as subjects. That single word sent chills through the room. It wasn't just abuse. It was dehumanization. And yet, despite the damning signs, not everything added up. Some evidence didn't make sense. Surveillance footage that should have shown key moments had missing timestamps. A neighbor's Ring camera mysteriously stopped working the night before the rescue. And the children, while clearly traumatized, gave conflicting accounts of what happened during their time in the house. One claimed they'd been there only a few months. Another insisted it had been years. The youngest kept referring to the lady before, someone Shannon had never mentioned. Could Shannon have taken over from someone else? Or was that just the child's fractured memory speaking through fear? These questions and more only deepen the darkness surrounding this case. Every new revelation cast doubt on what was previously assumed. Every piece of evidence seemed to create more fog instead of clarity. And as investigators continued to unravel the threads, it became painfully clear that this wasn't just about one woman and one house. There were others involved. People who knew. People who looked the other way. And maybe, just maybe, people still watching. You're not going to want to miss what happens next. Because just when detectives think they've reached the heart of the mystery, a single, terrifying discovery in the attic sends the entire investigation spiraling in a direction no one expected. And once you see what they found, you'll understand why this case changed everything. Just when investigators thought they were beginning to untangle the knots of Shannon Price's twisted world, a new wave of obstacles crashed down with unsettling force. The attic discovery, a set of old, dust-covered storage trunks, each labeled with dates and initials, had the potential to break the case wide open. But what was found inside raised even more questions. The trunks contained dozens of outdated camcorders and VHS tapes, all unmarked except for cryptic codes written in permanent marker. No labels. No explanations. Some tapes had been recorded over multiple times, creating an eerie jumble of footage. Birthday parties. Screaming in the background. Static. A man's voice reciting numbers. You said. These were different children. Children no one had reported missing. Children whose faces have never been identified. But then, just as forensics began transferring the tapes for analysis, something went wrong. These were different children. Children no one had reported missing. Children whose faces have never been identified. But then, just as forensics began transferring the tapes for analysis, something went wrong. A child crying softly in the dark. The footage was grainy, almost impossible to timestamp, but what chilled detectives the most was that none of the children currently in Shannon's custody appeared in the early videos. Overnight, the evidence locker where the tapes were stored was broken into. No signs of forced entry. No fingerprints. Just an empty shelf where the most damning materials had been kept. The internal security footage for that wing of the precinct? Glitched. 24 minutes of blank screen. Coincidence? Or inside job? Someone was watching. Someone was making sure the truth stayed buried. Worse, someone was also trying to silence the investigation. Lead detective Marissa Holloway, known for her tenacity in child exploitation cases, received a typed letter with no return address, no fingerprints, no DNA. Just 5 chilling words. Stop digging or you're next. That alone might not have stopped her. But the letter was accompanied by a photo, an image of her 8-year-old son walking home from school, time-stamped just 20 minutes before the envelope was delivered. Whoever was behind this wasn't just trying to hide the past. They were willing to strike the present. Despite the threat, Holloway couldn't walk away. She'd seen too much. She'd heard the children describe the quiet room, the injections, the strangers with masks. And that was before one of the children, a 10-year-old girl named Evie, whispered something that sent a jolt through the entire team. During a therapy session, she mentioned the church in the woods. At first, it seemed like a trauma-fueled memory, maybe symbolic. But when pressed, she described the location in stunning detail. A red door with black iron handles. A statue of an angel with no eyes. Candles always burning, even in daylight. Investigators scoured the region and, to their shock, found an abandoned mission just 30 miles north of the Price home that matched her description perfectly. The building was dilapidated and had no power. But inside, officers found remnants of what appeared to be ritualistic gatherings, charred wood in the shape of a circle, scraps of children's clothing, and a locked safe embedded in the stone floor beneath the altar. When opened, it revealed files, medical charts, photographs, lists of names, dates, symbols. But here's the twist. None of it was recent. The documents dated back more than 20 years. And on several pages, scribbled in the margins, was the name Shannon and Merton, a name not found in any public records connected to Shannon Price. Was this her original identity? A previous alias? Or had she been part of this decades ago as a child herself? The discovery sent shockwaves through the department. If Shannon was raised in this environment, was she a product of abuse-turned-predator? Or had she chosen to resurrect something that had long gone dark? Either way, it meant one thing. This wasn't the beginning, it was the continuation. And not everyone wanted it uncovered. One of the officers assisting in the case, Detective Eli Warner, began acting strangely. His reports were delayed. His phone records showed late-night calls to an unknown number. Then, without explanation, he requested a transfer to another unit, citing stress. But an anonymous tip, left as a voicemail to the department's ethics hotline, accused Warner of destroying a piece of critical evidence the night the VHS tapes disappeared. He denied everything, of course. Claimed it was a smear attempt. But the timing was suspicious. Too suspicious. As pressure mounted, Holloway made the decision to revisit Shannon's childhood records, digging into psychiatric files, school history, even old adoption papers. What she found was buried under layers of sealed documents and redacted reports. But one unfiltered note from a now-deceased child psychologist stood out. It read, "Subject is intelligent, manipulative, and exhibits signs of trauma-induced delusion." She claims the others still visit her at night, warned she may attempt to recreate experiences from early trauma. Who were the others? Were they real? Were they part of this cult-like group tied to the mission? Or just a figment of a fractured mind? Nothing could be confirmed. But the deeper they searched, the clearer it became. Shannon hadn't acted alone. She was either part of a larger network or someone had been guiding her from the shadows. The children remembered visitors. The neighbors saw the man with the van. And now, with evidence vanishing and threats being made, the clock was ticking fast. But then, just when the case reached peak confusion, a phone rang inside the Price home. The house had been sealed for weeks. Power had been cut. And yet, an old rotary phone sitting in the attic began to ring. Investigators, startled by the noise, answered. On the other end, a voice whispered a single sentence before hanging up. "You're asking the wrong questions." And just like that, everything they thought they knew about Shannon, the children, the church, the tapes, began to unravel. What if Shannon wasn't the puppet master? What if she was the puppet? And the real mastermind is still out there. Don't go anywhere, because what happens next will change everything you thought you knew about this case. As investigators scrambled to process the chilling message from the attic phone, the case took another unsettling turn, this time through someone entirely unexpected. Officer Lena Brooks, one of the newer additions to the precinct but known for her analytical precision, had been quietly running a side investigation into Shannon Price's financial records. On a hunch, she'd been tracing irregular wire transfers linked to shell companies, mostly dead ends, until one suddenly paid off. A recent deposit, dated just 2 weeks before Shannon's arrest, had been made to a checking account under a name that didn't appear anywhere in her known aliases or records, Jonah Merton. The surname immediately triggered alarms. It was too close to the mysterious Shannon and Merton discovered in the abandoned missions files. Brooks submitted a request to trace the account. But before the bank could provide confirmation, something unexplainable happened. Her personal laptop, used off-site for the financial dig, was remotely wiped in real time. Not just files deleted. The drive was wiped completely clean, as if it had never stored a single byte of data. Later that same night, Officer Brooks returned to her apartment to find her front door slightly ajar. Nothing stolen. Nothing obviously moved. But on her kitchen counter, placed neatly next to a photo of her and her younger sister, was a USB drive. No note. No explanation. Against protocol, she plugged it in. The only file inside was a low-quality video, time-stamped years before, showing Shannon, much younger, different hair, thinner, walking hand-in-hand with a teenage boy toward the same red-doored church Evie described in her therapy session. No audio. Just distant, muffled wind. And then, as the pair approached the statue of the eyeless angel, the camera slowly tilted toward a man standing at the door, tall, clean-shaven, wearing a gray trench coat. His face was shadowed, but carved into the base of the statue were the initials, JM. Was Jonah Merton not just an alias, but a real person? Could he be Shannon's brother, or even someone she once trusted and feared? And more urgently, was he still alive, pulling strings from behind the scenes? The implications rocked the team. If another person was involved, one connected not just emotionally but financially, they weren't looking at a lone, disturbed woman. They were staring into the face of a long-term, calculated operation that spanned years, possibly decades. And suddenly, no one could be ruled out. Tension within the precinct grew heavier with every passing day. Detective Warner, already under a cloud of suspicion for potentially destroying evidence, began acting erratically. He refused to answer questions, missed briefings, and was caught trying to remove a box of files that had been sealed for internal review. When confronted, he lashed out, accusing Holloway and Brooks of orchestrating a witch hunt. But before he could be suspended, He submitted a formal resignation and disappeared. No forwarding address. No known whereabouts. And just one day later, a courier arrived at Holloway's home with a package. No return label. Inside was one of the VHS tapes presumed to have been stolen from the precinct, along with a handwritten note. You were never supposed to see this. The tape showed something none of them were prepared for. It wasn't footage from the attic, or even of Shannon's home. It was shot in a hospital, dated 1996, and featured a woman being interviewed while strapped to a gurney. Her voice was shaky, disjointed, but she repeated one name over and over. Jonah. Jonah, he promised me I'd be safe. And carved into her forearm were those same initials again, Jan. This time accompanied by a crude drawing of the eyeless angel statue. The woman in the footage? She looked almost identical to Shannon Price. But the age didn't line up. Could it have been her mother? Or something else? DNA confirmation was impossible. The hospital where the video was filmed had burned down in 2001 in what was ruled as an electrical fire. But nothing about this felt like coincidence anymore. The deeper the detectives dug, the more contradictions appeared. One of the children, previously believed to have been rescued from Shannon's house, suddenly changed her story during a therapy session. She claimed Shannon saved her, that she'd been taken from another home, one with walls that cried, and that Shannon had brought her food, given her warm baths, and hid her from the man in the hat. When asked to draw him, the girl sketched a figure in a long coat and a wide-brimmed hat, standing next to the eyeless angel statue. The picture matched almost exactly the video still from the USB drive. Was Shannon a villain or a protector? Or had she been manipulated so deeply that she thought harming children was an act of salvation? Public pressure was mounting. News outlets were picking up fragments of the investigation, though the most disturbing details were being kept from the media. Social media exploded with theories. True crime YouTubers launched deep dives on the Red Door Church, cult symbolism, and whether Shannon was the victim of trauma-based mind control. Conspiracy hashtags like #AngelEyes, #ShannonFiles, and #WhoIsJonah Merton were trending on Twitter and TikTok. The case had transformed from a disturbing local crime to a nationwide obsession, and yet, the truth still felt maddeningly out of reach. Then came the final blow. An internal audit of the precinct revealed that several of the files pulled during the early investigation had never been officially logged. Surveillance footage from Shannon's interrogation was incomplete, and records of Evie's statements were missing timestamps and audio glitches. When a private tech consultant reviewed the files, he dropped a bombshell. Someone had remotely accessed the precinct's mainframe within 48 hours of Shannon's arrest using a level of encryption and stealth no civilian could easily pull off. This wasn't just a leak. This was a well-funded, highly skilled cover-up. At this point, everyone was a suspect. Every file felt compromised. Every truth seemed twisted. Holloway began to question whether the man they were chasing, this Jonah Merton, was even real, or a ghost story built to mask something much worse. And just as that possibility settled in, the phone rang again. Same line. Same attic. Same dusty receiver. But this time, the voice didn't whisper. It laughed. And then said, "You're not hunting me. I'm guiding you. The rules have changed. The hunt has just begun." Everything the detectives thought they understood was shattered the moment that voice echoed through the attic phone. "You're not hunting me. I'm guiding you." It wasn't just a taunt, it was a roadmap. A deliberate push deeper into the shadows. Holloway replayed the message again and again, analyzing every word, every breath, every pause. There was something disturbingly calm about the voice. It wasn't panicked or threatening. It was calculated. As if the person on the other end was orchestrating each step, laying breadcrumbs on purpose. But why? Why would someone so deeply embedded in such a disturbing web of crimes want to be found? That's when Officer Brooks made a connection that pulled the rug out from under the entire investigation. During a routine rewatch of the hospital VHS tape, the one supposedly showing a woman who looked like a younger Shannon, she noticed something no one had seen before. In the corner of the frame, briefly illuminated by the flickering overhead light, was a name badge clipped to the gown of the woman being restrained. It didn't say Shannon. It said Clarissa and Price. A quick search through old census data revealed a horrifying truth. Clarissa was Shannon's mother, and she had been institutionalized just months before Shannon's birth. Her mental health records, long buried and mislabeled in hospital archives, painted a picture of someone convinced she was being hunted by a group she called the Cleaners, people in gray coats who stole children to erase their pasts. Clarissa claimed that her daughter was taken by them before birth, that they implanted her, rewired her, and gave her a mission she wouldn't understand until it was too late. At the time, doctors diagnosed her with paranoid schizophrenia. But now, that diagnosis didn't feel so cut and dry. Brooks and Holloway scrambled to find Clarissa, only to discover she died under mysterious circumstances in 2003, a supposed overdose in a halfway house she'd only been in for 3 weeks. No family claimed the body. No autopsy was ever released. And buried within Clarissa's intake forms was the name of her caseworker, Jonah Merton. The man wasn't just part of Shannon's life. He had been lurking in the margins of her entire origin story. But the biggest twist came when Holloway, in a moment of desperation, went back to visit one of the rescued children, Evie. She'd been placed with a foster family under tight security, far away from the media frenzy. During their meeting, she asked Evie one simple question. Did Shannon ever tell you who Jonah was? The child's expression shifted. She hesitated, then opened her backpack and pulled out a crumpled, yellowing photo. It was one Holloway hadn't seen before. A group picture, taken in front of the Red Door Church. Shannon, Clarissa, and 2 men, one in a military uniform and the other in the now familiar trench coat. The man in uniform looked eerily familiar. Holloway took the photo back to the precinct and ran it through facial recognition software. The results stunned him. The man wasn't just some ghost from Shannon's past. He was Captain Raymond Holloway, his own father. A war veteran, long believed dead in combat, had in fact returned under a new identity and been one of the original founders of the Red Door Church. Records showed he'd purchased the property under a non-profit name, later linked to an unregistered orphanage program that operated under the guise of emergency placements, which explained why none of the children Shannon had rescued appeared in official state records. They were never in the system to begin with. Detective Holloway staggered back in disbelief. Every case he'd solved, every moral conviction he'd built his life around, now crumbled beneath the weight of this truth. His father, the man he'd idolized as a hero, was likely the architect of something far more sinister than anything Shannon could have ever orchestrated. It wasn't just about abuse. It was about erasure, manipulation, and a decades-long psychological experiment that blurred the line between trauma and obedience. Then came the final blow. As Holloway sat alone in his office, staring at the photograph, an envelope slid under his door. No return address. Inside was a single note, handwritten in block letters. She didn't steal those kids. She was returning them. Everything had been flipped upside down. Shannon wasn't abducting children. She was delivering them away from someone. But from who? From Jonah? From the remnants of a cult? Or from the very people Holloway thought he could trust? What if Shannon was never the villain? And what if the nightmare house was never hers? The question no longer was who orchestrated the horror, but who had been controlling the narrative all along. And someone somewhere was still rewriting it in real time. Detective Holloway didn't sleep that night. How could he? His hands trembled as he looked at the photo of his father once again, trying to make sense of the betrayal burning holes through the frame. The man who raised him with stories of bravery and sacrifice, the same man who supposedly died for his country, was now at the center of the darkest case Holloway had ever faced. Every memory now felt manipulated. Every lesson, every word of advice, tainted. The betrayal ran deeper than blood. It went straight into Holloway's soul. And yet, there was no time for mourning. Because while he was struggling to process his father's double life, something else happened that forced him to make a decision no child should ever have to make. Jonah Merton resurfaced. Not in person, but through a call made from a block number that traced back to a cell tower just miles from Holloway's own home. Jonah didn't threaten. He didn't demand. Instead, he offered a deal. He knew Holloway had the photo. He knew the investigation was spiraling closer to truths buried in classified files and locked basement doors. And he knew Holloway had a sister, Marcy, who lived a quiet, suburban life in North Carolina, completely unaware of the storm about to descend. Jonah's message was hauntingly simple: stop digging, and your family stays untouched. Keep going, and she learns everything the hard way. It wasn't a hypothetical threat. Attached to the message was a live image, a grainy but real-time shot of Marcy sitting at a coffee shop with her toddler. Holloway's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't about arrest warrants anymore. This was psychological warfare. And the enemy knew every crack in his armor. For hours, Holloway sat paralyzed, staring at the photo of his sister and her child. Was the truth worth the cost of his family's safety? Could he gamble the lives of the innocent for justice that might never come? Or worse, would his silence mean this nightmare continued, silently devouring more children who would never be found, never be named, and never be mourned? But the choice became even harder when Brooks returned with her own revelation. She had been going through old precinct surveillance logs, trying to map out where Jonah may have had help from within. That's when she saw something that shook her to her core. Multiple late-night data pulls from the evidence locker, all accessed under Holloway's own credentials, on nights he wasn't even in the building. Someone inside the department was using his identity to manipulate the case, and worse, delete files, reroute leads, and remove physical evidence from locked containers. It meant someone close to him, someone wearing the same badge, was feeding Jonah from the inside. The betrayal was no longer just historical. It was active. And the final punch came when Brooks hesitantly showed Holloway an internal memo she'd intercepted. A sealed transfer request for her, filed by an anonymous source. Effective immediately. Someone wanted her gone. Out of the way. Silenced. And her growing suspicion was that it wasn't just Jonah pulling strings. It might be someone higher up. Someone who had been shaping this entire case to look like a simple custody violation instead of what it really was: a coordinated system of abductions hidden behind foster programs, social work, and bureaucratic red tape. With his sister's life on the line, a partner about to be reassigned against her will, and his own identity hijacked to destroy the case from the inside, Holloway faced a choice that ripped him apart. He could go public, leak the evidence, break protocol, and risk his career, his badge, and possibly his life. Or he could step back, pretend to play along, and try to outsmart an enemy who seemed to anticipate his every move. But then, late that night, Holloway received an anonymous tip. No voice. Just a set of coordinates. And a note that read, "Come alone if you want to know what your father really built." The question wasn't whether Holloway would go. The air was thick with silence as Holloway pulled up to the coordinates. "I told you that digging too deep would hurt people. Now you're forcing me to make a choice I didn't want to make. Look at the screen." And there she was, Marcy, his sister, blindfolded, tied to a chair in what looked like a home basement. Her toddler screaming off-screen. Jonah's voice hardened. "You upload that drive and they both die. You turn around and leave now and they live." It was the final gambit. The final push to see if Holloway's loyalty to truth could outweigh his love for family. He stood frozen, bloodied, broken, staring at Brooks and then back at the terminal. His heart screamed. His mind fractured. But then Brooks whispered, "There's a third option." She pointed to the back of the room, a backup server, isolated and delayed by 30 minutes. They could upload the drive there, trigger a silent distribution, and give the appearance of failure. Jonah would think they backed down. But the world would receive the truth just a little later. The only catch? One of them had to stay behind and delay the kill switch in person, knowing they likely wouldn't make it out alive. Holloway didn't hesitate. He handed the drive to Brooks. "Get to the car. Drive. Don't stop until you're safe." She looked like she wanted to argue, but she knew better. With one final look, she vanished into the dark hallway. And Holloway turned toward the server, surrounded by sparks, sirens, and the ticking clock of a nightmare finally catching fire. But just as he began the upload, he heard a door behind him creak open. And a voice he hadn't heard in 23 years whispered, "I never died, Daniel. I was the first experiment. His father had returned, and the story wasn't over. The dust had barely settled when the world shifted. 30 minutes after Brooks fled the facility, the upload completed in the background like a quiet revolution. A tidal wave of secrets flooded secure government servers, whistleblower websites, and dark web forums. And within hours, headlines across every major outlet exploded with horrifying truths. Nightmare House program exposed, human testing ring funded by federal agencies, and rescued children reveal hidden trauma. Anonymous footage leaked from the facility showed faces, some familiar, some once trusted, participating in experiments that violated every moral boundary imaginable. For most Americans, it was a horror show they never imagined could be real. For Holloway, it was a war that had finally reached daylight. But he didn't live to see it. Not in the traditional sense. When authorities arrived at the site, they found the place abandoned, burnt out, half-flooded, with security systems torched and data wiped clean from the mainframe. There was no sign of Holloway's body. Only a bloodied watch, a cracked badge, and a final message scrawled on the wall behind the server. This ends here. No more children. The footage from the server had been pre-scheduled to release. The countdown had already expired when agents recovered the message. The world would know everything, even if the man who made it happen vanished without a trace. Brooks disappeared shortly after giving her full testimony. Her name was redacted from public records, and though she was offered protection, she knew too well what happened to people who trusted the system. She went off-grid, somewhere out west, raising her son in silence and caution, checking in once a year through a burner phone left in a safety deposit box Holloway had arranged years ago. She never told her son the whole story, only that someone brave had once saved them both, and gave everything so others could live free. Marcy survived. So did her child. Their rescue came as a result of an anonymous tip, coordinates, time, and even the name of the man holding them hostage. Jonah Merton was found dead from a gunshot wound to the head, a self-inflicted end, they said. But some questioned if it had really been suicide. His confession letter was too detailed, too calculated. Some said it read like a performance for the record books. Others believed it was part of a larger effort to protect the one still pulling the strings behind the curtain. But with Denton arrested, along with a dozen top-tier officials and corporate donors, the network began to crumble. Still, whispers of a larger machine remained, buried beneath government red tape and sealed court documents. In the months that followed, the rescued children began receiving care, though healing was far from simple. Therapy sessions turned into documentaries. Court testimonies morphed into viral clips titled, "Child Victim Speaks Out," and "Inside the Darkest Case in FBI History." America watched in collective disbelief as the faces of victims, now survivors, became symbols of both justice and unimaginable cruelty. Hashtags like #JusticeForTheChildren and #NightmareHouse trended for weeks. But for every voice demanding accountability, there were others questioning how such a system had existed in silence for so long. And then something strange happened. A photograph surfaced online. Grainy, black and white, taken from a gas station security camera in rural Montana. A man with a scar above his eyebrow, wearing a hooded jacket, standing at a payphone. He was speaking into the receiver, and in the reflection of the booth's glass, the faint image of a woman, Brooks, stood a few yards away, watching him. The photo went viral, igniting a firestorm of theories. Could Holloway still be alive? Had he faked his death to continue hunting the shadows? Some believed he was still out there, exposing more secrets, living in the cracks of the world he once tried to fix. Others thought it was a deep fake, a desperate conspiracy cooked up by those who couldn't accept that heroes sometimes disappear before their stories end. But maybe that was the point. Maybe Daniel Holloway wasn't meant to be remembered as a hero who won, but as a man who chose truth over safety, justice over comfort. He wasn't perfect. He had been broken, manipulated, even turned into a tool of the very people he'd come to fight. But in the end, he made a choice that most people never get to make, to expose evil, no matter the price. And for every child who was freed, every family who got answers, and every voice that was finally heard, that choice mattered. As the camera fades to black, one final line lingers on the screen, etched in white against the dark. Justice may come too late for some, but for the innocent, it must come loud enough for the world to hear. And just when the screen seems still, a subtle glitch flickers in the corner. Coordinates.
A date.
And a single word. Next. Because some nightmares don't end when the story does. They evolve. It was whether he'd come back alive.